faith that procures my justification, because works are all in sanctification. So if works can never enter into the faith that I need for justification, how can they ever qualify the faith that I need for justification? So he's in a double dilemma now. So in our Catholic theology, yes, we can rest very firmly that we are indeed justified and have peace with God.
Dr. White.
Well, I don't believe at all that when we say that our works somehow add to the process of justification, how that could possibly give a person peace. The peace that the Reformed person has is the acceptance of the fact that there is only one type of righteousness that can avail before God. And it is the righteousness of Jesus Christ that is given to us by faith, not by any works that we can do. If the idea is that we must do works to maintain God's gracious view of us, if the idea is that we have to have works that somehow qualify our faith, then there is no peace. And since Rome does teach that there are mortal sins that you can commit that will sever that relationship, then God himself becomes your judge, and the idea of terror really comes when you recognize that there is no way that you can know whether you have truly done all those things which are necessary for obtaining justification, as Ludwig Ott says in Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma. So I don't see how that is an answer that explains how you have true peace. And I'll stop right there.
Okay. Mr. Sungenis, your second question.
James, in James chapter 2, verse 25, he says this, "And in the same way was not also Rahab the harlot justified by works, when she received the messengers and sent them out another way?" From your perspective, could you explain why James uses that example and what it means in the context of justification with Abraham?
Certainly, as I commented before, the context of James chapter 2 is given to us in two ways. Verse 14 tells us that this is a section where James is decrying the said faith, the faith that exists only as words that individuals within the Christian community were claiming. And then in verse 18, he uses the word show us, demonstrate to us the reality of your faith without deeds. You cannot do so. None of us can look out upon the outward person and simply see that they truly have faith without what they do. And so in each of the examples, Abraham and then the example that you bring up, we are able to see, and I disagree with what you said earlier. You said there was no man witnessing the act that Abraham undertook on the mountain. I think you forgot about a man named Isaac who became a patriarch of Israel, and I think he was probably present at the altar himself since he was the one being offered. And so James's context is show me, show me. He's the Missouri apostle. He says, show me your faith. He wants to see the deeds, and those deeds demonstrate that a person is righteous. And indeed, as I use the very translation that comes from Luke Timothy Johnson, who is a Roman Catholic scholar, in his commentary on James in the Anchor Bible Commentary, page 237, he is a former monk, a conservative opponent of the Jesus Seminar, professor of New Testament at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University, and I would actually highly recommend his discussion of this particular passage, because he recognizes that what James and Paul are talking about are completely different contexts, completely different issues. So when Rahab did what she did, she was demonstrating her righteousness. She was demonstrating by what she did the consistency that must exist between true saving faith and the deeds of our lives. If we do not have true saving faith, that faith will not demonstrate itself.
Mr. Sungenis?
First of all, Isaac did not say, "Now I know you fear God," when Abraham was going to stick the knife in his chest. It was God who said, "Now I know you fear me." So God was the witness to that work. Second of all, you said that Rahab was demonstrating her righteousness, and that is an impossibility, because in Joshua chapter 2, Rahab had faith and works simultaneously. She was a harlot prior to the visit of the Jews. She then repented of her sin and did the work of hiding the spies. So there's no demarcation between her faith and her works. So there's no demonstration that you would have the same with Abraham, where you separate Abraham's faith and his demonstration of that faith in works by several years. And the import of this is the fact that James says, in the same way was not Rahab the harlot justified. So if she was justified without a demarcation between faith and works, that has to be the same with Abraham, else they would have two different justifications.
Dr. White, your third question.
It is your assertion in your book, Not by Faith Alone, that justification is a process wherein our works play a role. You likewise say that God chooses men upon the basis of seeing something in them that is pleasing to him. Specifically on page 671, speaking of Esau, of God's choice of Jacob over Esau, you wrote, election is intimately related to the individual's pleasing of God. And, quote, hence, love indicates that God has a personal liking of Jacob, even though Jacob sometimes sinned. We can understand God's personal liking of Jacob since Scripture portrays his life as one of love and service to God, while Esau is portrayed as godless and despicable from the beginning, end quote. Could you please explain why your words contradict Paul's teaching in Romans 9:11 through 13, where he taught that God chose Jacob, quote, before the twins were born, or had done anything good or bad, not by works, but by him who calls, end quote, as well as Paul's teaching in Romans 8:7 through 8, that the unregenerate man is incapable of doing anything that is pleasing to God?
Mr. Sungenis?
First of all, the Bible never says that man is incapable of doing anything that is pleasing to God. Second of all, in Romans chapter 9, when Paul is talking about the Jews were the very ones in verse 32 that Paul said tried to get to heaven by their works. The principal work being circumcision and ritual sacrifices and all those kinds of things. And so Paul has to take the argument back to the beginning where Jacob, in his mother's womb, had no chance to do ceremonial works, had no chance to do any ritual which the Jews were claiming as their own before God. God says, I chose him based on my own criterion, which is not what the Jews were claiming before God. They had claimed that because of circumcision and other things, that God owed them salvation. So God says, no, that's impossible, because God chose Jacob before all that could take place in his life. Now, Paul then quotes from Exodus 33 in Romans chapter 9, when he talks about, I will have mercy upon whom I have mercy, and compassion on whom I have compassion, which is taken from the conversation God has with Moses. Now, Moses was, in that chapter, the very one that God was pleased with, and God says in verse 11 of Exodus 33 that God spoke to Moses face to face, and then in the verse 17 he says, I am pleased with you, and I know you by name, and therefore I have compassion on whom I have compassion, and will have mercy upon whom I have mercy. So right from the very passage that Paul quotes in Exodus 33, he shows us the very reason why God shows mercy, and that's because of his relationship with Moses as opposed to his relationship with Israel, who had sinned by worshiping the golden calf.
All right, Dr. White, you have 1 minute.
First of all, Romans chapter 8, verses 7 through 8 says, because the mind set on the flesh is hostile toward God, for it does not subject itself to the law of God, for it is not even able to do so. And those who are in the flesh cannot please God. My question was, how is it that a person, an unregenerate person, cannot do anything that is pleasing to God? And Romans 8:8 says that such a person cannot do so. In Exodus 33, if you look at the actual text, you'll discover that Moses' choice by God was not based upon Moses being pleasing to God. The specific thing that it says is that he found chesed, loving kindness, mercy, grace in the eyes of God. And the emphasis in Exodus 33 is upon God's free choice of Moses, not that Moses was somehow better than someone else. God's election and choice is always based upon his freedom, never upon anything that is in the creature man.